In the spring of 1242, the Mongol army was raiding the outskirts of Vienna, which is a sentence most people have never had to think about because of what happened next, which is nothing. They had not lost a battle in Europe. Not one, not a bad day, not a draw, not a tactical withdrawal. In 2 years, they had beaten Russia, Poland, and Hungary. And then they packed up and went home. Not the way an army leaves. The way a delivery driver leaves when the address turns out to be wrong. Not defeated, not negotiated with. Nobody bribed them. They turned around at the edge of Western Europe and rode 6,000 kilometers east. They were not chased out. Nobody in Europe was in a position to chase anybody. Europe's entire contribution to this decision was standing nearby while it happened. Every history book gives you the same reason. Their emperor died, so the princes had to go home and vote for a new one. It's a great story. It's clean, it's ironic. It's the kind of thing that fits on a plaque. There is one problem with it. The official Mongol history says they didn't know he was dead. To understand how strange the retreat is, you have to understand what was retreating. By 1241, the Mongol Empire is the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever had, and it got that way in about 30 years, starting from a man who was, at one point, somebody's slave. 30 years is nothing. 30 years is a mortgage. The European campaign is commanded by Batu, Genghis Khan's grandson, a job he got the way most people got jobs in the 13th century, which is by being related to somebody. But the man actually running the battlefield is Subutai, who is at this point around 68 years old and has been winning battles since before most of his opponents were born. Subutai is one of the most successful commanders in recorded history, and almost nobody outside the field has heard of him, which is either a tragedy or excellent operational security. The empire he works for was assembled in one lifetime. Genghis dies in 1227. By 1241, his grandchildren run an operation stretching from the Pacific to the Danube. That is a company that went from a garage to global in one generation and then had to work out what a management structure is. That problem is going to matter enormously in about 4 minutes. Here is how the campaign went. March 1241. The Mongols come through the Vereke Pass into Hungary, which Hungary had blocked with felled trees, which worked for approximately as long as you would expect felled trees to work. April 9, 1241. Legnica in Poland. A Mongol column under Khadan destroys an allied army led by Henry II, Duke of Silesia. Henry does not survive it. April 11, 1241, 2 days later. 600 kilometers away. Read that again. 2 separate Mongol armies, 600 kilometers apart, fought 2 major battles 2 days apart, and it was coordinated. The second one is Mohi, on the Sajo River. How big the 2 armies were is genuinely disputed, and by disputed, I mean the estimates differ by a factor of 4. Contemporary chroniclers put King Bela IV's force around 60,000. Modern historians tend toward 15 to 25,000 aside. I'm going to avoid picking one because the number that matters isn't the size, it's the outcome. The Hungarians hold the bridge first. A Ruthenian slave warns them the Mongols are crossing it at night. They meet the attack and win. They cut down a great many and push the rest back into the river. For a few hours, Hungary is beating the Mongol Empire. Then 2 things happen at once. Subutai has gone south to throw up an emergency bridge of his own, and a second force has gone north to a ford. And at dawn, Batu brings up 7 stone-throwing engines and simply clears the bridge. Catapults, used as a door opener. Appreciate the escalation. The Hungarians brought a bridge defense. The Mongols brought siege artillery to a river crossing and also a second bridge, and also a third route, and used all 3. What follows is not a battle anymore. The Hungarian army is encircled, and the Mongols leave a gap in the ring. On purpose. The trapped men see the gap and do the obvious thing and run for it. Almost all of them are killed on the way out. Sit with that, because it tells you what you're dealing with. An enemy who understands that a cornered army fights hardest, so it gives them a door and puts the killing on the other side of it. Roughly 10,000 Hungarians die. Many drown in the rout. Bela escapes, the single most successful thing any European did in this entire campaign. He spends the next year being chased across his own country and then down the Dalmatian coast by a detachment whose entire job is to catch him, which they nearly do, repeatedly, in a pursuit that ends with the King of Hungary hiding on an island. By the end of 1241, the Mongols have taken most of Hungary. They raid Wiener Neustadt and Korniberg, which are south and north of Vienna respectively. That means they are on both sides of Vienna. In 1241, doing reconnaissance, which is the medieval equivalent of somebody walking around your house at night with a clipboard. Duke Frederick of Austria manages to catch and destroy one small Mongol squadron, and this gets written up at the time as a significant victory, which tells you exactly how the rest of it was going. That is the state of play going into 1242. The best news in Western Europe is that somebody killed a patrol. Before we get to the retreat, there's a piece of infrastructure you need. It's the reason the traditional explanation sounds so convincing. It's called the Yam. And it is, without much competition, the most modern thing anybody built in the 13th century. It is a relay network of post stations spaced roughly 30 to 60 kilometers apart, stretching across the entire empire. Nobody in Europe has anything like it. Nobody in Europe has thought of wanting anything like it. Every station holds spare horses, food and shelter. A rider comes in, hands the message to the next rider, and that rider goes. The rider rests. The message does not. Only authorized riders can use it. A network with no traffic control is just a road. The result is that information moved across the Mongol Empire at 200 to 300 kilometers a day. In the 13th century, across Asia, over mountains. That is roughly the speed of a modern person driving across a country while obeying the speed limit and stopping for lunch. The Mongols built a wide area network out of horses, and it ran at highway speed. And Europe, at the same moment, is a place where a message travels at the speed of one specific tired man. This is genuinely the Mongols' most impressive achievement, and it never makes the highlight reel, because it isn't a battle. Everybody wants to talk about the cavalry. The cavalry is downstream of the logistics, and it explains the thing that should have bothered you earlier. 2 battles, 600 kilometers apart, 2 days apart, coordinated. Not mysticism, not luck. A communications network doing what communications networks do. 400 years early. The Mongols did not outfight medieval Europe. They outmessaged it. And it matters for our story for one specific reason. If the Great Khan died in Mongolia, the Yam could get that news to Hungary in about 3 or 4 weeks. Hold on to that number. It's about to become the most inconvenient number in this video. December 11th, 1241. Ögedei Khan, son of Genghis, ruler of the empire, and the man credited with actually building the Yam, dies in Mongolia, which is its own small irony. The most efficient message-carrying system on Earth, and the first really important message it has to carry, is that the man who built it is gone. The traditional story goes like this. The news travels down the relay to Batu in Hungary. Batu is a prince of the blood and an heir. A new great Khan has to be elected at a general assembly. Every prince who wants a say has to be there in person. There is no proxy vote. The assembly is called a Kurultai, and it is not ceremonial. The Mongol Empire has no automatic succession. No eldest son gets it. The next great Khan is whoever the princes agree on, and if you are not in the room, they will agree on somebody who is. So Batu, standing at the doorstep of Western Europe with an unbeaten army, weighs a continent against a committee meeting and picks the committee meeting, which, to be fair to him, is the correct call. A continent is a thing you can come back for. A succession is not. And Europe is saved by a funeral. You can see why this story has survived for 800 years. It's perfect. The greatest military machine of the age is stopped, not by an army, but by its own succession paperwork. The source is Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, an Italian friar sent east by the Pope a few years later to find out what on earth had just happened, and who wrote the first serious European account of the Mongols. Sending a friar is, in fairness, cheaper than sending an army, and it had the additional advantage of being possible. He's a real source. He was actually there. He is not making things up. He is, however, a man being told a story by the people who had already decided what the story was. but he is writing down what he was told some years afterwards by people explaining a decision that had already been made, which is not lying. It's just the difference between a reason and a reason given. And there is another source, a better placed one. Rashid al-Din was a historian working for the Ilkhanate, a Mongol state run by Genghis Khan's descendants with access to Mongol records and Mongol officials. He is writing the official history of the empire from inside the empire. He is the better placed witness. He is also the more compromised one, because official histories are written by people with an interest in how things look. It is the 13th century equivalent of a company writing its own reviews. Both are true at once, which is the normal condition of every source anybody has ever used. And in it, he states plainly that the Mongols were not aware of Ögedei's death when they began the withdrawal. Which is, if you are the person writing the confident version of this story, extremely annoying. Let that sit. The most famous explanation in medieval military history is contradicted by the official history of the people who did it. And the dates don't rescue the traditional story either. Ögedei dies on the 11th of December. The withdrawal begins in late March, 3.5 months. On a network moving 200 kilometers a day, that is not tight. That is enough time for the message to arrive 4 times over, and for Batu to write back. So the timing doesn't prove the story, it just fails to disprove it. Which leaves the question genuinely open, and this is the point in the video where I have to stop being confident at you. If you came here for a clean answer, the clean answer is that there isn't one. And I'd rather tell you that than pick the prettiest option and say it firmly. Historians do not know why the Mongols left. That sentence has survived every attempt to improve it. There are 3 other explanations on the table, and none of them is stupid. A Mongol army is not an army in the European sense. It is an enormous herd of horses with people attached. Each man has several mounts. That entire mass has to eat every day off the land it is standing on. The Hungarian plain looks perfect for this, and it is in a dry year. Tree ring data suggests the invasion years turned cold and wet, and a cold, wet plain is not a pasture. It is a marsh. Marsh is bad for grass. Marsh is much worse for 100,000 horses. And a Mongol army that cannot feed its horses is not an army, it's a very large problem with hooves. There is something bleakly funny about the possibility that the campaign which terrified an entire continent was ended by damp. The first is grass, and I know how that sounds as a cause of anything. To put a number on the grass problem, a Mongol trooper on campaign is generally reckoned to have brought several horses of his own. Multiply that across an army and you are not moving a military force. You are moving a small nation of livestock, and it eats every single day whether or not there is a battle. An army like that doesn't run out of ammunition. It runs out of field. There is no supply convoy that fixes that, because the supply is the ground. The second is castles. The Mongols were extraordinary in open country and merely competent against stone. Hungary and Poland had a lot of stone. The campaign had turned into sieges. Slow, expensive, and precisely the fighting where the Mongol advantages stop mattering. There is no cavalry maneuver for a wall. The third is that it was simply far enough. They were at the western edge of the grasslands. Beyond that, forests, hills, castles every few miles, and a supply line back to a capital already governing more territory than anyone ever had. Sometimes an empire stops because it has reached the end of the terrain it is good at. Every conqueror in history eventually meets a landscape that just isn't interested. So they left. Late March 1242, the withdrawal starts. By mid-year, the Mongols are out of Central Europe. No announcement, no terms. Europe's great deliverance arrives in the form of an army simply not being there one morning. What they leave behind usually gets one sentence. Hungary was wrecked, and I want to spend a moment on that, because the Mongols left tends to get told as a happy ending by people who were not in Hungary. In the plains east of the Danube, at least half the villages were simply gone. Not damaged, gone, as in, the next map is shorter. Bela's own reconstruction program worked on the assumption that around 15% of the country's population had died in the invasion and in the famine that followed it. which killed people the Mongols never met. Bela comes back in May 1242 to a kingdom taken apart and does something genuinely impressive. He reads the defeat correctly. That is rarer than it sounds. The normal response to a catastrophic defeat is to decide you were unlucky or betrayed or insufficiently brave and do the same thing again with more conviction. His conclusion: Hungary lost because it fought the Mongols the way it knew how. In the open, in one enormous battle. And that was exactly the fight the Mongols wanted. So he stops doing that. And the alternative he picks is expensive in a way that has nothing to do with money. He gives up the royal monopoly on fortress building, giving away power permanently to his own nobles, which is the least appealing thing a medieval king can do. Nearly 100 new castles go up by the end of his reign, which is a lot of castles, and every single one of them is a small permanent admission that the crown is no longer the only thing with walls. He founds the fortified town of Buda in 1248, which within 20 years is the commercial center of the kingdom, a rare case of a government building something on a hill and it working. The castles matter for a specific reason. A castle does not beat a Mongol army. Nothing on that continent did. What a castle does is make the fight slow. And slow is the one thing a horse-based army cannot afford, because every extra week is another week of feeding an enormous herd off somebody else's fields. Bela could not outfight them, so he built a country that would waste their time. And he imports people. Germans, Moravians, Poles, Ruthenians. Settled into the emptied land with personal freedom and tax breaks, because a country with no population is not a country, it's a map. He is remembered as the second founder of the Hungarian state, which is a strange thing to call a king who lost the largest battle in his kingdom's history. Most kings get remembered for the win column, but it's accurate. The Hungary that exists after 1242 is a different construction from the one that existed before, and he built it on the assumption that they were coming back. They didn't, but that wasn't a safe assumption, and he was right not to make it. Being prepared for a thing that never happens is the least rewarded competence there is. Here's where we land. The Mongols reached the outskirts of Vienna and turned around, and nobody can tell you why. The story everyone knows, the Khan died, the princes went home, comes from a real source who was really there, and is contradicted by a better placed source who worked inside the empire. Two good witnesses, one event, no agreement. Welcome to the job. It might still be true. Rashid al-Din was writing decades later too, and official histories have their own reasons for saying things. Nobody in this argument is a neutral witness. There has never been one of those. And notice what the Mongol version is actually claiming. Not, we left for a different reason. It's, we didn't know yet. Which is a strange thing for an official history to volunteer, because it makes the empire's own famous communications network look slow. That's not the sort of detail a court historian invents to flatter anybody. And I want to be clear that "we don't know" is not a cop-out here. It's the actual finding. 800 years of people wanting a clean answer has not produced one. What we can say is that several things were true at once. The great Khan had died. The grass was failing. The castles were slow. The supply line was enormous. Any one of those is the kind of thing that shows up in a report as a bullet point and in a decision as a shrug. Any one of those is a reason. All four together is a decision. And the reason the funeral story survived is that it's the only version with a shape. A complicated interaction of climate, logistics, fortification density, and imperial succession is not a story. Their king died so they went home is a story. History is full of moments that got tidied into an anecdote because the anecdote was easier to carry. The anecdote is lighter. That's the whole reason it survived the journey. The uncomfortable version is that the most consequential military decision of the 13th century was probably made for several boring reasons at once, by men who did not know they were making it and who fully intended to come back. There is no monument in Vienna to the Battle of 1242 for the excellent reason that there wasn't one. The most important thing that ever nearly happened to the city produced no ruins, no casualty list, and no anniversary. Vienna never found out how close it came because there was never a battle to remember. The safest a city has ever been is the day an army looked at it, did the arithmetic, and went to get a drink of water somewhere else.